who was going to succeed her. She came to the conclusion that she would choose her mother's, she came to the conclusion she would choose her sister's son, her nephew. Now, her sister was married to a German prince, and they were all living in Holstein-Gottorp, and her nephew's name was Karl Patrick Ulrich, and he was Herzog von Holstein-Gottorp. His parents, Elizabeth's sister and brother-in-law, had died of smallpox, so little Karl Peter was an orphan, and living away. He was also the heir to the Swedish throne. But Elizabeth said, order him home to Russia. Home for him was in the Balkan states. It wasn't Russia, but he came back to Russia, and he became the Grand Duke Peter. He was by then 13 or 14. And of course, Elizabeth went to work to get him married. That's the first thing you do in a royal family, is make sure all the children are married so that they can produce more wonderful people like themselves, right? So she was shopping for a bride for her nephew, and who did she choose? You wouldn't believe this. It's so interesting. What did she choose? She chose a Prussian princess. Well, the Prussians were always the best people, I'll have you know. But they may be contentious and go to war with everybody, but it's for your own good. Anyway, a Prussian princess, of all things. Her name was Sophie Augusta Friederike von Erbs-Anhalt, and at home we called her Figgy. She and her mother, the Princess Friederike, came to St. Petersburg and spent a summer with Empress Elizabeth, so Elizabeth could find out what kind of a young lady she was. She approved. She found her very personable and attractive, and probably the perfect choice for her nephew's bride. So she was chosen, and the engagement announced. Then Sophie's mother went back to Germany, and Sophie's name was then changed to Katherine, or Catherine, and her religion was changed from Lutheran to Orthodox, as always, and she becomes the betrothed of the Grand Duke Peter. Well, just a few weeks before the wedding, which had been announced for 1746, I think, just before it was to take place, Peter came down with smallpox. Well, the wedding was postponed until he could stand unaided. He did survive. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever seen smallpox, but for those of you who haven't, the victim, of course, is covered from head to foot with blisters, pustule blisters. If they survive, the blisters break and scab over. When the scab falls away, you're left with a pit or a crater. But surrounding it, in the early stages of recovery, is a kind of welt or donut of puffy red pulsing flesh. So you're covered with these swollen, you're just totally covered, look horrible. Now the puffing red part goes away, and all you're left with eventually is the crater. But the wedding came and he was able to stand. They powdered him and put a wig on him, and he arrived at the wedding, but he was so horribly disfigured she couldn't look at him. Just a monster. Naturally, after the wedding, this marriage was not consummated. In fact, it never was consummated. She found out, Catherine did, we'll call her Catherine now, because that's how she's known in history, found out she had married a sadistic, vicious, neurotic little brute. And that's true. See, Elizabeth hadn't paid much attention to his personal nature in all her machinations, and Catherine, of course, didn't really know him at all until they were married. And oh my God, it was just awful. He was vicious. He tortured animals. He tortured the house servants. He went after his wife, gave her a beating, blackened her eye, did all of these things, chased her around, tormented her. In court, you're in public. There are always people present. You're never alone. If it's just the servants, and there were servants at all the doors. But usually a dinner table was a dinner of 50 or 30 or something like that. You were never private. Even in bed there were people around. You know, got a lot of servants. So her life was just getting away from this awful torment best she could. Well, after several years, believe it or not, more than 2 or 3 years passed, the Empress Elizabeth awakened to the fact that her granddaughter-in-law, her daughter-in-law, whatever you want to call her, Catherine, was not getting pregnant. What's the matter with you? The whole reason you're here is to bear children. Why aren't you doing it? Well, Elizabeth was so busy berating Catherine that Catherine could hardly get a word in. Finally, she screamed her down, "Shut up and listen!" I don't know how many of you are married to people who never listen. They're busy belly aching all the time, you know. You want to bash them over the head. Well, anyway, finally Elizabeth listened, and Catherine explained the nature of the husband. Oh, dear. Well, Elizabeth didn't want to hear this because she'd made the choice. But it wasn't long after that. Then the ducal couple met a very handsome young man named Sergei Zaltykov. The Empress Elizabeth introduced him as a fourth at bridge. Well, they sat down on several occasions to dine and visit and so on, and Zaltykov was pretty cute. And Catherine couldn't help but look at him, and he looked back. Oh dear. Well, the inevitable happened. She became pregnant. And 9 months later, she bore a son. Oh, what a relief. Elizabeth's whole efforts were vindicated. Now they had a royal heir. They named the child Paul. Elizabeth, the Empress, snatched Paul away from his mother and raised him herself. She was going to be a mama at last. A little late in the game. Well, you know, Catherine didn't have anything to say about it. But that's the way that went. Now, it wasn't very long after this, in 1760, Elizabeth had grown so enormous, they actually cut a hole in the ceiling of the palace to the next floor, put a crane in to hoist her in a crate up through the floor so they could roll her on wheels over to her bed. She couldn't stand without help. And that's, well, of course, her heart failed. She had a heart attack on Christmas Day, 1760, and died. I must say I rather liked Elizabeth. She was always charming and gracious, very expansive and outgoing and friendly, to say the least. But she was only 51 years old when she died. Well, now, Catherine had spent 16 years of torment already as Grand Duchess with this awful husband. Now what? She was the Empress consort because her husband was the Emperor Peter III. He was 33, she was 32. What was going to happen? Well, what happened was, on Coronation Day, Peter went to greet his court and said to them, as a sort of a general statement, "The greatest man in all the world, the man I consider my personal hero, is Frederick the Great of Prussia." What? And then he went on to say that all my generals are now to give back all the lands they have conquered from the Prussians over the past 40 years. It's all to be returned. Well, the generals were falling down in faint. My God, the man's a maniac. And immediately there was a subversive swell to get rid of him. They had to get rid of him. He's crazy. You can't. Eleanor Roosevelt had just climbed into bed with Adolf Hitler. Well, within weeks, a delegation of the Guards General's commanders went down to Tsarskoye Selo, where Catherine was hiding out. She knew something was going to happen. She went down there immediately and told her, or asked her actually, if, God forbid, anything should befall their beloved emperor, would she be willing to fill the role as ruler? She said, in effect, just try me. Well, but don't hurt him. All right, so they went back and began to evolve what they were going to do. Well, Peter, the emperor, heard about this almost immediately. He said, in effect, I don't give a damn of what you do. I hate you. I hate all the Russians. I want to get out of here. I'm going to go back to live in retirement in Horshin-Gotorp, where I came from, happily. Forget it. Well, that was a relief. Oh, we're all off the hook on that. But advisors close to the plotters said, no, you cannot let this man live. If he leaves the country, he will come back at the head of an army. You have to kill him. Well, this message was taken down to Katherine. Well, she didn't want to hear this. No, I don't want anything to happen to him. Well, they explained it, and finally she gave in and said, well, do what you have to do, but don't hurt him. Well, of course, they had other plans, and by this time, Peter had taken refuge in the Ropshaw Palace, which is a big fortified building on the outskirts of Petersburg then, probably downtown now. But he knew something was going to happen, and he was trying to save himself. One regiment declared their loyalty, so we have to wave our arm. There we go. That's why we're rebuilding the building. So he had gone out to the Ropshaw Palace to save himself, surrounded by a regiment that was supposed to be loyal to him. And the plotters, including the Orloff brothers, one of whom had been very intimate with Empress Catherine, they rounded up a group of other conspirators, and they went out to the palace. They were not stopped. Everybody was in on it now. The regiment supposedly protecting the empress is stepped aside. They went into the palace. Peter by then knew that they were coming in. His servants had said, they're coming. So he barricaded himself in his bedroom, crawled under the bed. But the conspirators got to the bedchamber, broke down the door, and came in, found him, dragged him out, and for 20 minutes they tried to kill him. They broke his arm, they broke his ribs, they put out an eye, they were stabbing him. Finally, they ended up sitting on his head with pillows and smothered him. It was a dreadful business, just dreadful. Well, a few weeks later, the announcement went out to all the citizens, the subjects of Russia. His Imperial Majesty, Peter III, has died of hemorrhoids.